Welcome. You're safe here. The world outside can wait. This is the sleep menu. Some stories move fast. This one doesn't. It's about a life that never stops moving, even when everything else does. Before we go further, if you're here for calm, for stillness, and for something to keep your mind gently tethered as you drift off, get comfortable. Let's begin. The builder was awake before the sun. Again. He didn't rise with a groan or a stretch, just opened his eyes, sat up, and reached for his boots. No one told him to start early. He just always did. That's how things stayed standing. Not with big gestures, but with small, steady decisions. The kind you don't even realize you're making until they've already shaped the day. His hut was small, a low roof, a short bed, and stacks of tools lined up neatly along the wall. Hammers, chisels, clamps, planks, rope. Nothing shiny, nothing new, just used, just reliable. The kind of tools that outlast hands. Each tool had its own spot. Each had its own wear marks, its own personality. He didn't have to look for them. His hands knew where they were, even in the dark. He didn't eat right away. First, he checked the scaffolding behind the town hall. A board had warped overnight. He saw it from halfway across the square. Years of habit trained his eyes to catch things others missed. He didn't say anything, just climbed up, pulled a nail, and replaced the board with another. A clean replacement, flush and even. Then, only then, did he return to sip water and eat a crust of bread, sitting on a stone with the sun barely over the rooftops. Others were starting to stir. Doors creaked. Smoke drifted from chimneys. The early clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed somewhere near the eastern wall. A dog barked once and fell silent. But the builder had already been working an hour, maybe 2. Time blurred when you were always halfway between projects. Sometimes he didn't know what day it was, only what needed doing. He didn't rush, never did. His pace wasn't slow, just deliberate. He moved like someone who knew the price of haste. A wall built too fast would lean by dusk. A roof patched without care would let in rain the next morning. He remembered every mistake he'd ever made. Not because he dwelled on them, because they built his rhythm. And rhythm was everything. A good builder didn't just work with tools. He worked with time. He fixed the gate latch that stuck in the cold. He rehung a door that had begun to drag against the floor. He marked a crack along the western tower with charcoal. Not yet a problem, but close. He'd keep an eye on it. If it spread, he'd brace it. If not, it could wait. The trick was knowing the difference. And in between, he paused. Just enough to breathe. Just enough to listen. The sound of a hammer too light meant a loose nail. The creak of a beam told him when it needed replacing. Even silence carried signals. Silence could mean something had shifted. A child ran by, chasing a chicken. The builder stepped aside. The chicken didn't. It brushed his leg. He didn't flinch, just kept walking. He'd seen bigger things fall apart. A startled bird wasn't enough to break his focus. No one cheered for the things he did. No one clapped when the scaffolding held or the roof didn't leak. Most didn't even notice. And that, he thought, was how he knew it was done right. The best work went unnoticed. The best work stayed invisible because it held everything else up. His job wasn't to stand out. It was to keep things standing, to make sure the ground stayed solid, the walls stayed upright, and the village could go about its day without worry. And that's exactly what he did, day after day, without complaint, without applause, just with quiet hands, clear eyes, and a rhythm all his own. The sun had barely climbed past the rooftops when he reached the eastern edge of the village. A wooden walkway stretched along the inner wall, creaking under his boots as he stepped across it, checking the beams for softness, the rails for looseness. He ran his hand along the grain, feeling more than looking. His eyes caught what his fingers missed. His fingers felt what the eye couldn't catch. The village didn't announce its damage. It whispered it, in bends, in warps, in sounds that were just slightly off. He carried no clipboard, no list. The village was the list. Every crack, every lean, every scuffed threshold told him what needed doing. It was never about fixing everything. Just the next thing, then the one after that. That was how the work stayed endless, and how it stayed manageable. One repair at a time. That was the rhythm that kept the place from falling apart. Today, the main path through the center square had begun to dip. Rainwater pooled there when the storms came through. Not much, just enough to matter. He knelt beside the low spot, pressed his palm flat against the dirt, still damp. He'd seen it coming a week ago. He was hoping it would settle on its own. It hadn't. The surface would need raising, the water redirected. If left alone, it would become more than a nuisance. It would become a habit, a flaw that spread through every passing boot step. He made a quiet note in his mind. He'd need gravel, maybe a few flat stones, nothing big. Just enough to bring the surface back up, stop the water from collecting again. Not urgent, but not something to ignore. That was the key to his work, knowing what could wait and what couldn't. And acting before waiting became regret. A young builder's assistant passed by, hauling a bucket of nails that clinked softly with each step. She nodded at him. He nodded back. That was enough. He didn't like wasting words, and she understood that. She was learning, watching, picking up on the rhythm, the unspoken logic of when to speak and when to act. Down by the granary, one of the storage racks had bowed under too much weight. He didn't blame anyone. People stacked things where they fit. That's what people do. But if the bottom buckled, the whole thing would tilt. He shifted the grain sacks off the lower tier, slid a wedge of wood underneath, and added a crossbeam behind it to brace the frame. It wasn't pretty, but it was stable. That's all it needed to be. Stability didn't need applause. It just needed to hold. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, noticing the way the morning light caught the dust in the air. He'd seen that same dust for years. It wasn't beautiful. It just meant the work was being done. Someone called his name. A short voice, urgent. He looked up. One of the young guards waved him over near the gatehouse. The ladder to the lookout post had cracked halfway down. Too many feet. Too many winters. He examined the damage, nodded once, and walked off without a word. He'd be back with a replacement by afternoon. The guard didn't ask questions. He didn't offer a timeline. They both knew he would return. Before returning to his hut, he stopped at the riverbank, just for a moment. Not to admire it, just to check the shoreline. A slow collapse had begun a month ago. Nothing dramatic, but soil moves, and water doesn't care what people build. He'd need to place some flat stones to keep it from eroding further. Another quiet task for another quiet morning. The river was patient, but not kind. It tested what was built, slowly, constantly. He crouched, picked up a handful of pebbles, let them fall through his fingers, felt their texture, thought about weight, about water flow. He didn't write plans. He wrote memory in layers, every problem stored in a quiet corner of his thoughts, ready to be solved when the moment opened up. He headed home with a mental map full of repairs, half-built plans, and slow warnings. No one assigned them. No one tracked them. But they waited for him all the same. The village didn't breathe unless someone watched its bones. And he always showed up. Not because he had to, but because no one else would quite the same way. The builder's hands were already dusted with sawdust by the time the rest of the village began to wake. He sat on the low wall near the well, smoothing the edge of a timber plank with quiet focus. Each stroke of the plane was steady, not rushed. He didn't check over his shoulder or glance up to see who watched. Not because he was unaware, but because it didn't matter. This was work, and work was the constant. A child approached with a broken stool, its leg splintered from a rough tumble. She didn't speak, just held it out, hopeful and silent. He took it without a word, examined the joint, turned it once, and nodded. It wasn't urgent, but it would be done. He gestured for her to leave it by his tools. She obeyed and skipped off, trusting it would return whole. Behind him, the sound of hooves struck stone, a delivery wagon returning from the outer farms. The driver raised a hand in greeting. The builder lifted his chin in reply. The wheel on the wagon wobbled just slightly. He noticed. He always noticed. Another quiet fix for another quiet hour. His next task brought him to the edge of the barracks. A post supporting the roofed walkway had cracked near its base, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He crouched, pressed his thumb against the wood. Software damp, beginning to rot. He fetched a replacement from the lumber pile behind the storehouse, one of the straighter cuts he'd saved from a storm-felled tree last season. He swapped the posts in silence, measuring the angle with his eyes, securing the join with patience and practiced rhythm. No one offered to help. They didn't need to. This was his domain, not by title, but by trust. Lunch came and went. He ate standing, a wedge of bread and some dried meat tucked into his palm. He chewed as he walked, passing the guardhouse, nodding to the posted sentry. A loose shingle hung above the doorway. He didn't have a ladder with him. That was fine. He'd return with one later, another note stored behind his eyes. By late afternoon, his body was tired but not sluggish. Fatigue had become familiar. Something lived with, not fought. He stopped by the workshop to oil his tools, wiping each one down with a cloth blackened from long use. The smell of the oil was sharp and grounding, like wood smoke and rust and time. The stool waited where the girl had left it. He picked it up, turned it, tested the balance. With a few new dowels and a touch of glue, the leg was true again. He placed it beside the door to dry, ready for tomorrow. As the light began to lower across the rooftops, he walked the square one last time, not to admire, to listen. The village made its own kind of music. Hinges, footsteps, the creak of rope. It told him things if he stayed quiet enough. He nodded once to himself and headed home. Another day added to the quiet ledger, only he kept. Another day, the village stood without breaking. Because he had shown up. The night had been calm, but the builder still woke before the sky turned blue. He didn't need an alarm. His body followed a rhythm shaped by seasons and scaffolds. He pulled on the same boots, tied with the same frayed laces, and stepped into the chill without hesitation. Morning frost lingered on the edges of rooftops. He paused outside his hut and looked up at the faint stars still clinging to the sky. He didn't wish. He didn't dream. He simply noted their position, then turned his eyes back to the earth. The first thing he did was check the foundation stones near the northern wall. There'd been a deep frost 2 nights ago. That kind of cold could shift things. Just a little, but enough. He crouched, placed a palm flat on the lowest stones, and pressed gently. Still firm, still dry, but the crack between the 4th and 5th stone had widened. Not a risk yet, but one to track. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin scrap of charcoal, marking the wall above the weak point. Nothing flashy, just a small X. He'd know what it meant later. He continued on, past the well, past the corner where the bakers would soon be lighting their ovens. He caught the scent of flour before the smoke, a sign they were on time. That mattered more than most realized. If the bread was late, so was everything else. A loose shutter clattered against a house post with the wind. He stepped onto the porch and secured it with a strip of cloth and a knot that would hold, until someone with hinges could spare the parts. It wasn't elegant, but it was quiet now. A few steps later, he found a gap in the fencing near the livestock pen. The post had rotted halfway through, the inside hollow as a drum. He tested its give, then went back for a new one. It took him 20 minutes to dig the hole, drop in the replacement, and pack it tight with gravel and stomped soil. He hammered the boards back in place with a rhythm that felt like breathing. He worked alone, not because he preferred it, but because it meant fewer explanations, fewer delays. Each task led smoothly to the next, each movement built on the last. By the time the village square filled with voices and carts, he was already halfway through a fresh plank path that would stretch behind the food stores. It wasn't required, but he'd seen too many people slip there after rain. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't expect a nod. He just laid the boards flat, one by one, his fingers brushing off dirt, his eyes checking each angle. And when he paused, it was only to scan the village again. Not for flaws, but for signals, movement, sound, a shift in the air, because something always needed fixing. And he would be the one to fix it. By midday, the builder's shirt clung to his back, damp with effort, but never discomfort. He wiped his brow with a forearm, glanced once toward the sun, then ducked under the eaves of the granary for a drink from his canteen. Just a few swallows, just enough to reset. The cool water tasted like metal and dust, but it revived him more than anything else could. A pause, a swallow, then back to it. He didn't sit. He never sat unless the task required it. Even in rest, his eyes kept moving, scanning rooftops, corners, ladders, chimneys. Every part of the village had a language. You learned to read it, or things started falling. Cracks widened, hinges failed. A board shifted when it shouldn't. These weren't random details. They were quiet messages. A thud behind the carpenter's shed caught his attention. A loose shutter had come unmoored, slapping against the wall in the breeze. He crossed the square with calm steps, not hurrying. Urgency could wait until it was needed. The hinge had split. He found a spare strap in his tool bag, pulled 2 nails from a pouch, and rehung the shutter so it wouldn't speak again unless spoken to. He didn't look up for praise. He didn't need thanks. The silence was enough. From the bakery chimney, a thick curl of smoke rose too fast. He frowned. That usually meant the flue hadn't been cleaned. If left alone, soot would build. Sparks would catch. Fire moved faster than mistakes. He marked it silently in his mind, a task not for now, but soon. He'd return with his scraper and brush before the week was done. He passed a group of children stacking stones along the side of a path, trying to build their own little wall. It leaned badly, already sagging. He knelt beside them for a moment, repositioned one stone, added a second at its base, and stood up without a word. They looked at what he'd done, understood, and kept building. Their laughter was quiet, shaped by concentration. He didn't interrupt it. That was the sound of the future learning. Outside the armory, a shield rack wobbled on uneven ground. He shoved a flat stone beneath one leg, tapped it once to steady it, and moved on. Not every fix required a rebuild. Most just needed attention. Most of the time, care could do more than brute effort. A shift here, a nudge there. The kind of work no one remembered, but everyone relied on. Someone called his name from the stables. A gate latch had jammed again, rusted from last week's storm. He arrived, examined it, and walked back to his hut for a small file and a jar of oil. It wasn't broken, just ignored. A few strokes, a twist, a wipe. It moved like new. He tested it 3 times, not because he doubted himself, but because he trusted habit. His hands moved faster than his thoughts sometimes, shaped by years of quiet repetition. He walked past the grain bins and saw one of the slats bowing outward. A rat could squeeze through if left unchecked. He made a note of it. He'd reinforce it tomorrow with a new strip of wood, seal the gap with pitch. That bin held more than grain. It held winter. Letting it fail would cost too much. As the sun lowered toward the treetops, he took one last loop around the square. The boards he'd laid behind the food stores were already trodden with the dust of a dozen passing feet. They held. They didn't creak. That was enough. The marks of foot traffic were quiet praise. If something broke metal, it would have shouted, but there was no sound. Just silence and steadiness. He passed the marked wall again and noted the crack hadn't changed. Good. He'd still watch it. He never assumed a crack stayed quiet. Every change was slow until it wasn't. Near his hut, the repaired shutter stayed still in the breeze. The livestock pen post didn't shift when the wind leaned on it. The path was dry, flat, solid. Even the smallest improvements made the hole stronger, the kind of strength you couldn't measure until it was missing. He allowed himself a slow breath. The day was heavy, but not wasted. He'd touched a dozen corners of the village, not to reshape them, just to keep them holding. The village wasn't perfect, but it was standing. And tomorrow, it would still be standing. Because he'd be there, ready, before the first door opened, tools in hand, ears open, eyes steady. Because something always needed fixing, and he would fix it. Not with noise, not with glory, just with patience and presence. Just with showing up. The wind had dropped by the time he stepped back outside. The sky above the village was now a deep blue, soft and wide, with the last edge of sunlight glowing low behind the rooftops. It was the kind of light that stretched the shadows and soaked the corners of buildings in gold. The warmth had faded from the air, leaving only the smell of stone, dust, cooling iron, and the faintest whisper of earth still holding onto the day. He moved along the southern path where the cobbles shifted ever so slightly underfoot. It wasn't enough to trip anyone, not yet, but he marked the uneven spot in his memory, the kind of flaw that wouldn't hurt anyone until it did. He slowed, scanned the joints between each stone. One of them was sinking more than the others. A few more days, and it would rock under weight, then crack, and then someone might stumble, even fall. Little things always led to bigger ones if they were ignored. He crouched, pressed his fingers into the dirt at the edges. Software too soft. Water again. Maybe from the well, maybe from the rains earlier in the week, or maybe from a slow leak in the buried lines that carried runoff away from the square. Either way, it was spreading. He stood, brushed the dust from his hands, and kept moving. There was no time to dwell, only to keep notes in his head and solve what he could. On the way to the courtyard, he passed by a clothesline where someone had forgotten to take in a blanket. He paused just long enough to lift it from the rope and fold it over the low wall nearby, under the eaves where the night damp wouldn't reach. No one would notice. But tomorrow, someone would wonder why the blanket stayed dry, and they'd never know. That was the whole point. The village didn't need to see the hands that kept it steady. It only needed to stay standing. There was a corner of the outer fence where the boards always warped in the cold. Every year. He reached it just as the lanterns flickered higher, casting long shadows across the ground. The boards were bowing again, just slightly. He leaned into the posts, testing their give. One would need replacing by the end of the season, maybe sooner, if another frost came through. He ran his hand down the grain, feeling the rise and dip, the weathered wear of too many seasons. Then he turned back toward the center of the village. He heard a creak above him, the kind that came not from footsteps but from tired wood. He looked up. One of the second-story walkways needed new bracing. He'd put that off too long. It was still holding, but just barely. He noted it and moved on. The list in his head never got shorter. It simply shifted, reordered itself, as the village told him where to look next. At his hut. He didn't enter right away. He set his tools by the door, then sat on the step, elbows on knees. Around him, the village was quieting. A distant laugh, the scrape of a pot, someone humming in a low voice. The sky had deepened into navy, with only a sliver of moon watching from the edge of the horizon. A breeze stirred the dust in lazy spirals. He closed his eyes just for a moment. Not to sleep, just to breathe. He thought about the cracks he'd seen, the ones no one else had. The little shifts, the leaning fence, the twisted latch, the missing stone near the forge, the soft cobble, the creaking plank above, all of it sitting in his memory like stones in a pouch. Nothing critical. Not yet. But that was the point. The work wasn't about rescuing what was broken. It was about seeing the break before it came, understanding where pressure would build, where weather would slip through, where time would take its toll. And tomorrow, he'd begin again. Not with a grand gesture or a marked moment, just with a steady hand, quiet steps, and eyes trained to catch what others missed. Because in a village like this, peace didn't happen on its own. Someone had to hold the quiet together, and that someone was him. The morning started slow, not because there was less to do, there never was, but because the air itself seemed to pause. The first light didn't push through the sky. It seeped, soft, gray, hesitant. The kind of light that made the village feel still, even when it wasn't. Even the birds held back for a while, their songs delayed like the breath before a word. He moved through the square with his tools in hand. Not heavy tools, just the basics. Enough for patchwork and precision. His belt clinked quietly with each step, each motion calculated to avoid waste. There was no need for big repairs this early. The big work came later. Mornings were for listening, for catching what the night might have changed, for finding the things that bent instead of broke. By the outer wall, a ladder leaned slightly wrong. Not dangerous, not broken, just crooked. He straightened it, adjusted the footing, reset the hooks so they gripped right. It took maybe a minute. No one saw him do it. No one needed to. That was the whole point. The best kind of work was the kind no one ever noticed had been done. A gust of wind stirred the dust near the training yard. At the far edge, one of the targets had begun to slump. The ground beneath it was soft from rain, and the post had started to lean. He dug a small trench around the base, packed fresh gravel, reset the support, tamped it firm with the back of a shovel. It stood straight again. Another thing the recruits wouldn't trip over. He brushed his hands on his trousers, left no mark. Past the blacksmith shop, smoke curled from the chimney, the low clink of metal already ringing in rhythm. The air smelled of coal and sweat and iron. He nodded to the smith, who didn't pause his work but gave a small wave in return. They understood each other. No wasted words, just acknowledgement between people who kept things standing. There was a drip along the northern walkway, a slow tap from a misaligned eave. He climbed onto the low roof, adjusted the gutter with 2 wedges and a twist of rope, just enough to shift the angle. The drip stopped. The sound vanished. Silence filled the gap. He crouched at the edge, watching the village below, life moving in layers, children trailing behind mothers, guards trading posts, smoke rising, dogs barking once, and then going quiet. The baker stepped from his shop with a tray of bread, the steam trailing behind him like a banner. All of it functioning, all of it depending on the little things staying solid. He made his way toward the storehouse. The door stuck on humid mornings. Today was no different. He shaved a sliver from the bottom with a hand plane, smoothed the edge, tested the swing. It moved clean now, the kind of fix no one would think about again. A moment's trouble erased before it became a pattern. The carpenter's apprentice waved as she passed, carrying a bundle of scrap wood. He gave a slight nod. Her steps were confident now. She'd been watching him, learning without instruction, picking up the rhythm. Not every day needed something big. Most didn't. But every day had weight. Small weights, creaks, tilts, threads that needed tightening before they snapped, routines that, if ignored, became failures. He didn't let them become that. He didn't wait for things to break. He listened. He moved. He fixed. That was the rhythm, and he never let it slip. Because if he did, the village might still stand, but it wouldn't hold. The wind picked up by mid-morning. Not strong. Just enough to flutter banners and rattle anything left hanging. It was the kind of breeze that made loose shutters clatter and reminded people to secure what they forgot. He felt it in his shoulders before he saw it in the trees. He made his way to the southern edge of the village, where the storage pens backed up against the wall. A canvas tarp had pulled loose from its ties, flapping like a warning flag. The crates underneath it were stacked with tools. Saws, mallets, iron nails, sorted in clay jars. None of them covered now. He climbed onto a crate, pulled the tarp tight, and secured it with 2 new knots, not rushed, not decorative, just strong. Behind him, the livestock pen gate creaked with every gust. The top hinge had worn unevenly over time, not from neglect, but from use. He stepped over and pressed his thumb to the bolt. It shifted slightly. Not enough to fail, but close. He would return later with a hammer and a wedge. For now, he tied the gate shut with a loop of twine from his pouch. Temporary, but safe. A few paces away, the stone path dipped where roots had begun to push beneath it. The stones had shifted, just barely. Enough to catch a toe or roll an ankle. He crouched and pressed his hand flat against the path, finding the raised edge. He shifted one stone with the heel of his boot, pushing it back into place. Another he lifted, flipped, and resettled. Not perfect, but better. One more pass tomorrow and it would be clean. The sky remained overcast. Clouds moved quick but never broke. It wasn't gloomy, just hushed. The kind of weather that made people stay inside a little longer, speak a little softer. But the builder moved through it like always. Steady, quiet, watching. He stopped by the old watchtower, one of the first structures ever built in the village. Its foundation stones were solid, but the wooden supports had aged. He knocked gently along each beam with a knuckle, listening to the tone. One sounded hollow. He pressed closer, squinting at a split running just beneath a bolt. Tomorrow he'd bring a brace. Before noon, he visited the tool shed, sorting planks and restacking nails. He ran his hand over the wall, pausing at a fresh knot in the wood. Someone had patched it recently. The work was clean. He smiled. Not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't his. Someone else was learning. Across the square, a wheelbarrow wobbled unevenly down a slope, loaded with fresh-cut lumber. A boy struggled with the handle, too much weight pulling it sideways. The builder stepped in, caught the tilt, and helped guide it back onto the path. No lecture, no praise. Just a nod, and the boy nodded back. The work never called his name, but he always heard it. Not in noise, but in absence. The quiet signs that something needed to be steadied. And so, he kept moving, because stillness for him wasn't rest. It was the gap before something slipped. Midday had come and gone, marked not by a bell or announcement, but by the subtle shift in light. Shadows shortened, the air grew warmer, and the voices in the village took on a more tired tone. Meals were eaten, water was drawn, dogs settled into patches of shade. But the builder didn't stop. He never truly stopped. The heat didn't slow him. It only softened his pace, made each movement a little more measured. He moved toward the market stalls now, where awnings flapped lazily and carts stood half unloaded. The smells of dried herbs and ripening fruit hung thick in the air. One stall's table had started to lean, the front right leg half buried in a soft patch of soil from last night's watering. He crouched, ran his fingers along the base, and packed in a handful of gravel from his pouch. The stall steadied. He gave it a small push with his palm, balanced again. The owner offered a wordless gesture of thanks as she continued sorting her goods. He nodded once. That was enough. A child had dropped a basket of apples. Most had rolled into the dirt, gathering dust and bruises. The builder didn't speak, just stepped in and began gathering them. His hands moved quickly but gently. He handed each one back silently. No scolding. No questions. Just help. He took a cracked slat from the bottom of the basket and tucked it under his arm. He would fix it after sundown. For now, it was enough to carry the break with him. A quiet promise of restoration. Further down the path, near the grain silo, the handle on a pulley had loosened. He reached up and tested the motion. Too much give. The rope held, but the bracket was splitting where it met the wood. He wound it temporarily with a strip of cloth torn from an old sleeve in his pouch, just enough to keep it moving without jerking. He'd return later with new wood and a brace. Maybe a fresh bolt if the threading was worn. He noted it all without speaking. The plan made itself. The village well had a new squeak, a different pitch than yesterday. He turned the crank slowly, letting it speak to him. The wood was drying out, rubbing in a place it hadn't before. It would need oil. Maybe a slight sanding. Nothing urgent, but something to note. He added it to the silent list he carried everywhere, a map that only he could read, made of memory, repetition, and care. Near the animal pens, one of the water troughs had tipped slightly. A goat had rubbed against it too many times. He wedged a flat stone beneath the low side and nudged the weight back, evenly. The water settled smooth again. The goat sniffed at him once, then wandered off with a snort. He smiled faintly, but didn't linger. He turned next to a fence post that leaned too far out. Not enough to fall, but enough to catch the eye. He loosened the earth around it, reset the base, and packed it tight again. Took a few minutes. Would hold for another season. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and leaned against the tool shed for a breath. It wasn't rest, exactly. Just a pause, long enough to listen. A wagon passed behind him, its wheel thudding slightly every few turns. Another thing to look at later. A quiet sort of satisfaction settled into his chest. Not pride, just the calm that came when things aligned, when the small wrongs were nudged right again before they grew teeth. That was what the work gave him. A village that held together. And a reason to keep going. He passed the outer wall on his return, his fingers brushing the surface as he walked. He stopped at one place, knelt, and picked up a fallen nail. Bent, dull, but still worth saving. He pocketed it without looking. Maybe it would hold something tomorrow. He didn't speak much. He didn't slow much. But the work, in its steady rhythm, gave him all the reason he needed. Nothing broken, nothing shouting, just things in need of keeping. And he kept them, one quiet step at a time. The heat lingered into the afternoon, laying thick over the rooftops and settling into the spaces between buildings, the kind of warmth that made wood expand and ropes pull tighter on their hooks. Sounds changed in weather like this. Footsteps were heavier, hammers softer. The village moved slower, but it still moved. The builder was near the watchtower again, checking the base where the old timber beam met stone. He crouched, pressed his palm against the surface, and waited. No flex, no shift, just the dry smell of sun-baked grain and earth, still holding, for now. From above, a call came down from the tower guard. Nothing urgent, just a rope pulley that had snagged. The builder climbed the narrow steps without a word, his boots thudding quietly against the wooden slats. At the top, he inspected the pulley, unwrapped the rope where it had twisted, and smoothed the guide with a strip of wax cloth. It slid cleanly again. He nodded to the guard. The guard nodded back. That was the exchange. Brief, clear, understood. Coming down, he noticed a gap between the boards in the lookout floor. Not large, but enough to catch a heel. He marked it with a chalk line from his belt pouch. He'd return when things cooled down. Cutting new boards in heat like this would only crack them. In the alley behind the food stores, he found a barrel that had begun to lean. Its base sat on uneven stones, and the weight had pulled one of the iron bands loose. He used a small wedge and mallet to brace the bottom, then pressed the band back into place. A quiet thump. A settled barrel. No one saw it, but he didn't need them to. As he stepped away, he heard a hinge groan. Sharp, metallic, dry. The back door to the kitchen had started to resist its swing. He reached into his pouch, pulled a small jar of thick oil, and worked a drop into the joint with his fingertip. He moved the door once, twice, 3 times. The groan disappeared. Toward the edge of the square, near the well, a flagstone had cracked clean down the middle. Not wide yet, but it would be. He knelt, traced the fracture, and made a note of its direction. If he caught it early, he could replace just the one. Wait too long, and 3 or 4 would shift. He rose slowly, stretching his back. The ache familiar, but never welcome. A pair of children passed by, laughing, one of them dragging a stick along a wooden fence. It clicked softly, evenly, one board at a time, until it didn't. The sound skipped. The builder looked. A loose plank, barely holding. He'd return with nails by sundown. Everything he did today mattered tomorrow, and the day after that. Even if no one noticed, the village did. It held its breath in quiet places, waiting for someone to keep it whole. And he always did. The evening crept in without ceremony. The shadows lengthened quietly, painting long fingers across stone and wood. The warmth from the day didn't leave so much as it settled into the walls, into the earth, into the builder's shoulders. The heat became memory, baked into everything, and as the lights softened, so did the sounds. The clang of tools gave way to hushed voices, and even the birds seemed to lower their calls. He moved toward the quietest edge of the village, near the old garden plots that few used now. A low fence surrounded them, half forgotten but still upright. Mostly. One corner had begun to sag where the post had rotted at the base. He leaned down, tested it, and nodded to himself. The soil would be soft enough to work by morning. He could already feel the resistance of the earth in his mind. Not yet muddy, not too dry. It would give just enough. There was a bench nearby, half covered in creeping vines. The wood was weathered smooth. Its legs settled unevenly into the dirt. He paused, brushed off the seat with the side of his hand, and sat. Not for long, just enough to stretch his knees and feel the stillness. He ran a hand along the grain absent-mindedly, tracing years of wear with his fingertips. Birds called in the trees overhead, not in alarm, just in routine. Everything in the village had a rhythm. The birds, the breeze, the builder. It was a quiet chorus, all of it, held together by the unseen. Across the path, a rain barrel had come loose from its support. The stand was old, one leg bowing under the weight. The ring around the barrel had slipped a finger's width off-center. He walked over, drained a bit of water from the spout, watching the flow catch the fading light. Then, he shifted the weight just enough to brace it with a chunk of stone pulled from a nearby wall's base. Temporary, but steady. He noted it for tomorrow. The good kind of temporary. The kind that bought time without inviting failure. Even in this quiet, his mind kept working. Behind the barracks, there was a roof tile missing. He'd seen it earlier, just a flash of sky between shingles, and the gate latch on the northern path stuck if pulled too fast. These weren't emergencies. But they were cracks, and cracks were how the weather got in, how the wind whispered where it shouldn't. Small things turned into large ones. If you listened, the village told you what it needed. Softly, without urgency, but with certainty. A lantern flickered near the center of town, dimmer than the others. Its flame dipped and caught, dipped again. He passed by and adjusted the wick with the tip of his knife. The flame steadied. No one saw. No one needed to. A small fix and a smoother night for whoever walked past. And when they passed, they wouldn't think of it. That was the measure of his success. He looked up then. Not often, but sometimes. The sky was shifting from blue to bruised purple, stars not yet visible but promised. The clouds thinned, moving slowly eastward like cloth being pulled across a table. He stood there for just a breath and felt the weight of the day settle. His shoulders ached, but they were familiar aches, ones earned and understood. The path home was always last. He didn't choose it that way. It just happened. There was always one more hinge to oil, one more step to test, one more thread in the village's fabric that needed quiet tightening. The work didn't end. It just quieted. Until the next board bent, the next rope frayed, the next stone slipped, and he would be there, not waiting, not watching, moving, always moving, because the village didn't hold itself together. He did. The morning after felt slower, but not because he moved any less. It was the kind of slow that came from calm skies and even air. A pause, not a delay. The village breathed in low and even, and he matched its rhythm. The world felt softer under his feet. The air less rushed. He noticed how the leaves barely stirred, how the birds delayed their song, how even the chimneys released their smoke in slow, drifting lines. Everything seemed to operate a few beats behind its usual pace, and that suited him just fine. He stepped out of his hut with a small bundle of tools wrapped in cloth. Nothing special, just what he needed today. A chisel, a few wedges, some spare nails, a coil of wire, and a folded strip of oiled leather for quick repairs. No heavy gear, no big repairs. Today was for the things that didn't yell, the ones that just needed to be noticed, the parts of the village that waited patiently. He had already decided where to start. The fence post, by the garden plot. It had been leaning for days, but today felt right for fixing something that quiet. He had passed it enough times to know it was ready. The sun was low, just high enough to catch the tops of roofs, casting the world in the long shadows of early morning. Dew still clung to the grass, and his boots left faint prints behind him as he walked. He reached the garden fence and knelt down, testing the softness of the soil. It gave easily, the kind of soft that told him he wouldn't need more than a few stones to hold the post. He pulled the broken one loose, shaking free the splinters from its base, and cleared the hole with his hands. The earth smelled damp and alive. The new post went in smooth, braced with care. He packed the dirt tight, added 2 stones to anchor it, then stepped back. No sway, no tilt. A small lean, corrected. Past the corner, a row of wooden slats along the shed had begun to curl at their edges. Heat had warped them, slow and quiet over the past few weeks. They bowed just enough to let the rain slip in. He pressed them flat again, one by one, securing each with a fresh nail. The sound of the hammer was dull and steady, not loud enough to disturb, just enough to carry. A rhythm only he heard. A rhythm that had repeated itself thousands of times over the years, quietly marking the heartbeat of the village. A rooster crowed nearby. The village was fully waking now. A door opened. Water splashed into a bucket. A laugh floated out from behind a curtain. The scent of baking bread drifted from the bakery chimney, and chickens began scratching the earth for feed. Wheels rolled over cobblestones. He could hear someone sweeping a stoop. But the builder kept working. He always worked best when the world was only half awake. when everything was still stretching its limbs. This was when things could be fixed without interruption, when he could listen. He moved to the northern path. The gate latch, the one that stuck, was waiting. He loosened the bolt, filed the edge smooth, and adjusted the hinge by a hair. It clicked open with no resistance. He opened it, closed it, opened it again. Perfect. The kind of fix that would last without anyone ever knowing it was done. The kind that let life move without friction. He gave the wood a final tap with his knuckle and moved on. At the well, a stone had shifted where people often stood to draw water. Too many feet, too much weight. He lifted it, cleared the grit beneath, and reset it into the earth. Balanced, secure. Another small tilt undone. He pressed his hand against it, then moved on. His eyes scanned the nearby path automatically, noting where moss had crept into the cracks, where a railing leaned slightly, where a rope swayed too loose. The morning warmed slowly, but the builder didn't pause. Every turn brought another thing quietly asking for attention. A bent hinge on a window shutter. A cart whose wheel needed truing. A broken strap on a gate. A loose plank underfoot where someone might trip. A rope too tight around a beam. He kept moving, not with urgency, but with purpose. He carried each need in his mind like a song, one verse at a time. And he sang it in steps, in hammer taps, in quiet fixes that only the wood and stone would remember. By the time the sun had risen high enough to erase the shadows, he had already touched a dozen different places. None of them dramatic, none of them worth a story, but each one mattered. Each one prevented a stumble, a break, a bigger problem. He didn't do it for thanks. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because that's what the village needed. Because while the village woke to the sound of life, he listened for the soft groans and creaks that came with it. The things most didn't hear until they became too loud. The things that whispered instead of shouted. And he answered them. Every single time. The sun was higher now, and the village had settled into its midday rhythm. Children's voices echoed in the distance. The clang of a hammer rang from the smithy, and somewhere nearby, a broom swept in slow, deliberate strokes. It was the kind of hour where everything moved a little slower, wrapped in the heat, lulled by routine. The builder, however, didn't slow. He worked in the shade where he could, shifting his path not to rest but to be smart with his energy. At the base of the bell tower, a series of steps had worn unevenly from years of use. He ran his boot over the edge of one and felt the dip, enough to catch a toe. He fetched a trowel from his pouch and packed a mixture of dirt and crushed stone into the gap. Not a permanent fix, but a good one for now. He tamped it down until it sat flush with the rest, gave it a final pat, and moved on. The path to the granary passed a narrow row of sheds, utility spaces, where old tools and spare wood were kept. One of the doors had begun to tilt on its hinge. He stopped, pulled it open gently, and watched how it moved. The top hinge had sagged. He removed the pin, realigned the bracket, and drove the pin back in with the butt of his palm. The door closed straight now. It was the kind of thing someone would notice without realizing it. Easier motion, less drag, but no thought of why. He liked it that way. He walked past the outer fencing where a small tree had started to grow through the slats. It had been left too long. The wood bent around the trunk now. Cutting the tree would take time and care, but for today, he just trimmed the branches away from the path. He didn't rush it. You couldn't fight growth with speed. You had to meet it with patience. Across the yard, he noticed a bundle of kindling leaning against a wall, half collapsed. He restacked it carefully, pulling the warped pieces aside, placing the straighter ones at the base. When the family who used it came out later, they wouldn't have to shift or search. It would be ready. The sun shifted again. Not down yet, but drifting. The shadows grew longer across the square. He checked the troughs at the edge of the stables, made sure each one was still level. Tipped water meant wasted effort, and every drop counted. He adjusted the legs on one, added a wedge beneath another, and brushed away the collected leaves before the breeze turned them into clogging mulch. All around him, life moved, quietly. The village carried itself on habits, and those habits were only possible because the structures beneath them didn't fail. That was his work. He didn't stop it. He didn't announce it. He simply walked into the spaces where something leaned, and he made it steady. That was the rhythm. Fix, step, listen, move. Not because something was broken, but because everything deserved to hold together just a little longer. By late afternoon, the light had taken on a different weight, softer, more golden. It slipped between fence posts and rooftops, like something intentional. The day wasn't over, but it had clearly decided to slow down. The heat hung gently in the air, no longer demanding, just present. Shadows stretched long across the village paths, and even the birds had quieted. The soundscape of the day shifted, from the busyness of work to the hush of winding down. The builder walked the edge of the storage yard, where barrels leaned against a wall in a neat line. Almost. One of them tilted a little too far. Not dangerously, but enough to bother him. He didn't rush. He knelt, repositioned a pair of stones beneath its base, and shifted the weight back to balance. One breath, one correction. He checked the rest, brushing dust off lids, nudging rope ends tighter, pulling one cover a little more snug. No one had asked. Nothing had failed. But that was the job, to catch the wrong turn before it finished turning. Every tilt left too long could become a crack. Every crack, a collapse. He knew the cycle. The wind lifted slightly, carrying the dry scent of hay and burnt wood and the faint metallic echo of the blacksmith's hammer. It tugged gently at his sleeves as he moved toward the die racks. One beam had split clean at the end, the crack subtle but ready to spread. He felt along its edge, thumb tracing the grain. Without words, without thought, he took out a replacement he had cut 2 days ago. Not out of foresight, just habit. He always kept a few extra. The swap took minutes. When it was done, he ran his hand across the surface once. Smooth. Done. Just enough friction to feel real, just enough resistance to know it would hold. Near the grain store, a wheelbarrow rested at an odd angle. The wheel had started to buckle. Left like that, it had jammed the axle, or worse, cracked the hub. He tipped it, pulled the axle free, and braced it against a stone. 3 hits with the hammer, not 4. He listened each time. The 4th would have bent it back the wrong way. He slid it into place, gave it a push. It rolled silent. He picked a bit of hay off the handle, then set it in line with the others. No wobble, no resistance. There was a small wooden bridge at the village edge, more footpath than structure. It crossed a stream barely deeper than his boots. But children used it. So he checked the railing. One post rocked when pressed. He crouched, slid in a wedge, and tapped it firm. He ran a hand across the top rail and felt the shift stop, just enough to hold. The water passed underneath in a steady murmur, the way it always had. He didn't rush away. He stayed a few extra seconds, watching a leaf float beneath the planks. Back in the square, a sign swung loosely in the wind, creaking against its iron bracket. It had hung there for years, a hand-painted board with weather-faded letters. He reached up, steadied the hinge with his hand, and wedged a slip of cloth in the space that squeaked. The breeze pushed it again. No sound. He looked at it once, then moved on. Quiet, restored. He paused when a shutter banged softly behind him. One hinge had started to loosen. He climbed onto the stone sill and drove the bolt tighter. A small job. Easy to ignore. But tonight, when someone latched that window against the dark, it would feel solid. That mattered. He stopped by a fence gate near the bakery, where the latch had always caught too high. He adjusted the hinge plate, sanded the catch slightly with a scrap of rough cloth, and swung the gate back and forth until it moved without drag. In the background, he could hear laughter and the soft clink of dishes, signs of the evening meal beginning. The village didn't applaud. The village didn't thank him. But it moved smoother now. It breathed easier. The quiet was fuller, and he walked on, satisfied not by praise but by the weight that had quietly lifted, one fix at a time. The first sound he noticed wasn't a creak or a snap. It was the quiet rustle of fabric being taken in from a clothesline. That, and the low thump of a door closing gently. Evening wasn't fully here yet, but it had sent a message ahead. The air held that in-between weight, not quite day, not quite night. Light had gone gold and soft. Shadows stretched long but still clung to edges, not quite committing. The builder stood near the back of the storehouse, sharpening a chisel on a stone he'd mounted to the wall years ago. The stone was worn smooth from years of passes. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, tracing the edge of the metal like he was listening to it. He wasn't preparing for a specific task, not yet. He was just keeping the edge ready. A sharp tool saved time. A dull one made more work later, and more work later meant more risk. He never liked surprises. He slid the chisel into his pouch and crossed the path to the animal pens. One of the posts had begun to list outward, not dangerously, but enough to let a curious goat test its boundaries. He pushed the post gently, confirmed the movement, then dug at the base with a small hand tool until he could wedge a flat rock underneath. The stone clicked into place with a low sound, and he tapped it firm with the heel of his boot. The post shifted back, firm again. He gave it a push. No give. Just enough tension to hold. A few feet away, a feeding trough had been gouged, likely by a horn. He crouched beside it and felt along the edge. The splinter could catch skin or tear fabric. He sanded it smooth with a bit of leather-wrapped stone, turning his hand over the same groove again and again until the bite was gone. The surface caught the golden light as he worked, then faded back into shadow as he stood. Not far from the well, he found a stack of firewood beginning to slump. The bottom row had shifted unevenly, probably nudged by children at play or someone in a hurry. He restacked it slowly, building it like a wall, wide base, tight core, balanced top. He knocked one piece loose to replace a warped log underneath, ran his hand along the row, then reset the stack. By the time he finished, the shadow of the woodpile had stretched halfway across the path, growing longer by the minute. On his way back through the center square, he noticed a lantern leaning slightly in its bracket. He straightened it with a twist, then tightened the bolt with the edge of his tool. A small flicker, then a steady flame. It would burn clean tonight. That meant fewer insects gathering, less smoke drifting, fewer reasons for someone to fiddle with it later. He took a longer route toward home, not because he was done, but because the air had cooled enough to make walking easier. He passed a storage shed, paused, and ran a hand along its frame. One corner was damp. He pressed his thumb into the wood. Software. Too soft. He could feel the slow rot spreading. He marked it with a bit of chalk and leaned back. He'd replace the beam before the rains came. He'd have to. A loose nail on the fence caught his attention. It stuck out just slightly, angled in the way that could snag a sleeve or catch a child's hand. He tapped it in with the butt of his chisel. A quiet fix. The kind no one would see, unless it hadn't been done. And then it would be all anyone noticed. He walked past the bakery, caught a hint of warm spice in the air, saw the shopkeeper latch the shutters with practiced ease. Further on, someone tugged a stubborn door closed, and he made a note of the sound. The hinge had stiffened again. When he finally turned toward his own door, the sky had deepened. Not quite night, but close. The kind of dusk that made everything look softer. The last of the color slid off the rooftops. The wind had settled. The village, for now, was quiet. He didn't feel finished, but he didn't expect to. Some things weren't meant to end, just carried forward, one steady fix at a time. The sky looked tired, not stormy, not clouded, just worn, like parchment that had been folded too many times. That kind of sky usually meant the day had something left to give, but it would take its time letting it go. The color had faded from blue to a dull, dusty silver, stretched thin across the horizon. Not threatening, not promising, just waiting, like everything else. The builder stood beside the community well, elbow deep in a cracked wooden bucket. One of the iron bands had slipped, letting the wood staves loosen just enough to leak. He pressed the band down and twisted it back into alignment. The wood creaked, but held. He poured a small ladle of water over the rim to check. No more drip. The surface of the water shimmered for a second, then settled, mirroring the blank, tired sky above. Behind him, someone was sweeping grain husks from the stone path. He didn't look back, but the rhythm of the broom matched his own. Slow, steady, deliberate. The sound of the bristles across stone echoed faintly in the still air. It was a quiet hour, the kind where sounds overlap without interrupting each other. A door hinge moaned softly somewhere in the distance. A faint laugh drifted through an open window. Everything sat in balance. He crossed the path to the back of the grain store, where a stack of woven sacks leaned too heavily to one side. The bottom corner had begun to sag into the earth. Moisture had soaked into the burlap. He shifted one sack at a time, restacking them from the ground up, placing a flat board underneath to lift the weight off the dirt. Each sack thudded into place with soft finality. When he finished, he placed 2 flat stones at either side of the stack to brace them, just in case. Along the stable wall, he spotted a cracked hinge on the tool shed. It still held, but not for long. He ran his fingers along the gap, measured its give, then unhooked the door and replaced the hinge entirely. Rust had eaten into the screws, so he drove in new ones with a slow, controlled pressure. The door swung better afterward, quieter. No scrape. He stepped inside and checked the shelving. One shelf bowed under too much weight. He moved half the tools to the neighboring rack, tested the support, and nodded to himself. He stepped back and wiped his hands on his trousers. The wind had shifted, cooler now, coming from the east. It brought with it the scent of stew, maybe lentils, maybe something with barley. Smoke, too, faint and dry, curling from a chimney nearby. His stomach noted it, but he didn't pause. Hunger could wait. A loose gatepost leaned nearby, half disguised by a cluster of reeds. He steadied it, braced it with a wedge, and tamped the soil around it with his heel. Near the well again, he noticed a length of rope fraying where it tied off at the bucket post. It would hold another day, maybe 2, but it was already unwinding. He untied it, cut the bad section off, and re-knotted the good length tighter around the beam. He tested the pull. No stretch, no slip. He ran a quick check of the pulleys, too, greasing them with a dab from a cloth he always kept folded in his pocket. A cat jumped up onto the stone ledge near him, eyeing the well. He didn't acknowledge it, but he didn't shoo it off either. It sat there, tail flicking, as he brushed off his tools and packed them away. A few moments passed. The cat purred, just once, and then leapt off, vanishing around the corner. The village behind him was winding down. Voices softened. Footsteps slowed. Doors closed with intention instead of urgency. The distant creak of a chair. The low hum of someone finishing a tune. All the little sounds that signaled an ending, or at least a pause. He stood still, watching the last of the light catch in the cracks between rooftops. The day had offered no praise, no thanks, no acknowledgement. But everything, for now, was holding in place, and that was enough. Evening had almost settled, but not quite. The clouds had taken on a muted glow like the dying embers of a fire. Not burning, but still warm. Light stretched thin across the rooftops, casting faint halos on chimney tops and outlining the edges of leaves. The kind of light that asked for quiet. Birds had long since gone still, and only the occasional rustle from the underbrush gave the sense that the village hadn't quite closed its eyes. The builder sat on the edge of a stone bench, rewrapping the leather grip on a worn mallet. He turned it slowly in his hands, checking the fit of the new strip with each coil. The old one had come loose earlier that day, barely noticeable, just enough to slip under sweat. A small risk, but one he wouldn't let grow. Each twist of the leather was practiced, hands moving with the kind of certainty that only comes from hundreds of repetitions. He stood, stretched his legs, and crossed to the small herb garden near the temple wall. A fence post had started to split from the bottom, warped by damp earth and time. He leaned into it slightly, then returned with a replacement post from a nearby shed. In minutes, the old one was pried loose, and the new one driven into place. He packed the earth tight around it and steadied it with 2 stones. No shift, no give. He brushed his hands on his trousers and gave it a final nudge, to be sure. Across the courtyard, a set of stairs leading to a cellar had begun collecting silt from the last rain, slippery, uneven. He took a flat-edged board and scraped each step clean, then dug a small channel at the side of the path to divert the next runoff. It wasn't complicated, just necessary. The marks left by his tool cut clean lines into the dirt, channeling water before it had a chance to pool. The kind of work no one notices until it isn't done. He paused near a shuttered window, catching a glimpse of flickering light inside. Someone lighting a candle, moving through their evening. A child's laughter broke through briefly, then disappeared behind a closing door. A dog barked once. A pot clanged somewhere further off. He waited a second longer, then moved on. The world behind those windows would carry on just the same, but he liked knowing it had no sharp edges left to stumble over. Outside the bakery, he adjusted the hinge on the delivery hatch. It caught on the stone frame every morning, and though it hadn't broken, it would, eventually. A small wedge and 2 careful taps realigned the board. When he opened and shut it, it moved smooth. That was enough. He dusted off his hands, paused to smell the last waft of warmth escaping from the bricks, and then stepped aside as someone passed with a flour sack slung over their shoulder. Past the square, a shutter was banging lazily in the soft wind. He climbed a short wall, tightened the hinge bolt, and added a slip of cloth to dampen the movement. The wood sighed as it settled. He crouched there for a moment, letting the wind push past him. It carried dust and the smell of lavender, probably from the apothecary's back room. By now the street was nearly empty. A pair of voices in conversation faded down a lane. A lantern flared to life outside the inn. Somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barked once, then went quiet. The stillness wasn't total. It breathed. It flexed. But it asked for quiet. He stood at the corner of the square, hands at his sides, tools packed away, and watched as a breeze stirred the dust. Nothing called to him. Nothing sagged. Nothing scraped. At least not right now. Even the tavern's usual creak at the hinge had gone silent. He'd fixed that days ago. And now it stayed quiet, just like everything else. That silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The kind of weight he knew well. A finished task, a steady step, an unnoticed peace. He let it settle in his chest for a moment longer, then turned, not hurried, toward whatever needed him next. Maybe tomorrow, maybe sooner. Even if it hadn't spoken yet, he'd already begun listening. Night arrived slowly, like ink spilled across the edges of parchment. Rain. creeping in without rush, but certain. The last glimmers of color in the sky bled into gray, then blue, then something closer to charcoal. Lamps flickered one by one in windows, not because it was cold, but because the dark had finally asked for light. The builder stood by the well again, though not for water this time. A stack of timber leaned against the stone ring, left there by someone earlier. He inspected the pile, some of it warped, some of it fine. He sorted it into 2 stacks, setting aside the pieces worth keeping. The rest he'd chop down into kindling later. From there, he walked to the edge of the carpentry shed. The door was open just slightly, not wide, but enough to make it clear the latch had slipped again. He examined the strike plate and noticed the wood frame had worn smooth. He cut a thin strip of scrap pine and nailed it into place. Now the latch clicked with a firm, satisfying sound. Not too loud, just right. Further down, he passed a storage box with a bowed lid. Moisture had swollen the wood. He loosened the side hinges and sanded down the corner where the lid snagged. He worked by the light of a single lantern, shadows crossing his hands as he moved. It took time, but the lid finally settled flush again. He didn't say much, even to himself, but he thought about the day, all its quiet pieces, the people who passed him, the tasks undone, then done, the kind of rhythm that didn't come from a schedule, but from listening. The path near the apiary had been slippery with fallen leaves. He swept it clear with a wide bristled broom, not wanting anyone to slip tomorrow morning. The air there was sharp with the scent of wax and pollen. Bees had long gone quiet, but he still gave the hives a gentle glance on his way past, as if nodding to neighbors. He paused near the outer wall and looked out into the dark fields. A breeze carried in from open ground, cooler now, brushing the back of his neck. He breathed in through his nose and let it go slow. Beyond the stone wall, nothing moved. He checked the fastenings on the north gate before returning, the kind of habit that didn't need explaining. One hinge squealed faintly. He added a drop of oil from the tin in his belt and turned the hinge twice until it moved clean. When he made his way back to the square, it was fully night. The buildings around him glowed gently from within, windows soft like low embers. He stood at the center, surrounded by quiet. No voices, no motion, just stillness. It was the kind of moment where nothing called for him. And yet, he didn't leave. Not right away. Because this, too, was part of the work, knowing when to pause, when to let the silence speak first. The sky by now had darkened into a deep, heavy blue, stitched with thin clouds and stars that blinked open, one by one. It was past the hour where most people would be found outside. Doors were shut. Lanterns behind windows cast pools of amber against shutters. And yet, the builder remained on his feet. He started near the edge of the tool shed, crouched low beside a line of worn paving stones. Moss had crept between them, slick and likely to catch someone off guard come morning. He worked silently with a dull-bladed scraper, loosening the green tufts and sweeping them aside. No one would notice it was gone, only that the path felt safer. Further along, a thin crack had spread across the threshold of the granary. It wasn't wide yet, but he'd seen these before. If left, water would follow. Then time. Then damage. He mixed a bit of sand and ash into a fine paste and pressed it into the seam. He smoothed it out with the heel of his hand, leaving only a faint line in the stone. Invisible. Durable. He moved with ease toward the older wall that bordered the livestock pens. A loose plank creaked as he stepped on it. He stopped, pressed down again, then gently pried it up and reset the nails, tapping them in until the wood sat, flush again. One of the posts nearby leaned a little too far. Not a risk now, but soon. He dug out a brace from the nearby shed and anchored it at the base. Slow work, but the kind that bought time. Off to the left, he noticed an odd shape beneath a tree. It was a bucket, turned on its side and half buried in dry leaves. He picked it up, brushed it clean, and hung it properly by the spout on the post where it belonged. A tiny act, but it kept the place from sliding into disorder. As he made his way back through the rear path, a lantern above flickered unevenly. The wick had burned low, curling oddly. He trimmed it quickly, adjusted the oil, and relit it. The light glowed, steady now, casting long shadows across the stone. He stopped for a moment to lean against the wall beside the dye house, not from exhaustion, just to listen. Somewhere behind him, someone laughed quietly. A chair scraped gently across a wooden floor. Life continued, even when he wasn't looking directly at it. His fingers brushed over a rough patch on the wall. He'd need to patch it tomorrow, maybe early, before the sun came in hard. He made a mental note, and then pushed off the wall, walking again. Not because he was chasing something unfinished, but because in places like this, something always was, and he preferred to meet it before it made a sound. The wind shifted just slightly, enough to rattle a loose shutter and carry the scent of distant pine across the rooftops. The night had fully arrived. Not a shadow of evening, but the deep, quiet dark that settled with weight. There were no more footsteps, no more chores being finished in haste. Just the still rhythm of a village asleep. The builder stood near the rain catch beside the apothecary. The basin had filled unevenly after last night's storm. A cluster of wet leaves clung to the edge, stopping the flow into the lower barrel. He reached in, scooped them out with his hand, and watched the water resume its slow, measured drip. He listened to it a moment longer, letting the sound become part of the quiet. Nearby, a wooden cart had begun to tilt where one wheel sat in soft earth. It hadn't toppled, but it was leaning hard to one side. He lifted the front handle, slid a flat stone beneath the wheel, and steadied it. Then he propped another under the opposite side, not because it was needed now, but because it might be later. That was the difference between patching and preparing. Along the path, a length of rope had been left draped over a fence post. Weather would wear it quickly like that. He coiled it cleanly and tucked it beneath the awning where it belonged. Then, passing a tool left leaning against a shed wall, he paused. A hoe, left out, forgotten. He wiped the handle with a cloth and slid it gently back into its rack. He passed the well and glanced at the pulley. It moved smooth, quiet, just as he'd left it. Still, he gave it a soft turn. Not because he didn't trust it, but because sometimes a quiet thing needed reminding it was still seen. Toward the outskirts, he stopped by the training grounds. No one would be there this late, but a section of the wooden fence had come loose, barely clinging to its post. He wedged it back into place and tied it with a length of twine he carried for jobs just like this. Temporary, but strong. The night was cooler now. Not cold, but enough to pull the heat from stones and stir the corners of fabric left to hang. He walked slowly, scanning the ground and listening. Not for sound, but for absence. Of tension, of weight, of friction where there shouldn't be any. At a bench near the square, he paused. Not to sit, just to rest one hand on its edge. The wood was smooth, the bolts still tight. Nothing asked for him here. So, he moved on. Not every part of the village needed him. Not every corner was waiting to fail. But he visited them anyway, because care wasn't just for what was broken. It was for what still worked. So it stayed that way. Mist clung low to the ground, curling along the paths like it wasn't sure where to settle. The stars were clearer now, punched into the dark sky like cold little holes. Everything was quiet. Not just still, but softened. The kind of quiet that made even footsteps feel too loud. So the builder walked slower. He started by the edge of the old bell tower. No one had rung it in weeks, maybe longer. But the bracket that held the rope pulley had loosened, swaying a little with each breeze. He climbed the short inner steps, steadied the bracket, and replaced 2 nails with heavier ones. The wood groaned as he worked, then fell still. Back on the ground, he passed a small crate tucked beneath a stairwell. Its slats were separating, and something inside had begun to poke through. He pressed the boards back together and reinforced them with a pair of wedges from his pouch. He didn't know what was stored there, didn't need to. The container was the part that mattered. Near the north-facing homes, he found a weathered bench with one missing support. It hadn't collapsed, but it had begun to lean. He cut a replacement leg from a short beam he'd stashed in a nearby alcove. One he kept there just for work like this, and fixed it into place. Now it sat level again. It looked right. More importantly, it felt right. He swept loose stones from a narrow alley where carts sometimes passed, collecting them into a small pile against the wall. He didn't carry them off. Not yet. But they wouldn't be a hazard now. Just one less thing waiting to cause a stumble. Further along, a torch bracket had worked itself loose from a support post. The flame guttered in the wind, casting uneven light across the path. He steadied the bracket with a wedge, pressed it firm, and leaned back to make sure the glow fell straight. A simple fix, but it changed how the shadows moved. A soft noise made him pause. Just a curtain shifting behind a window, or maybe fabric brushed by a breeze. Nothing urgent, nothing that asked anything of him. But he stayed there for a moment longer, listening to the spaces between sounds. Sometimes the work was loud, breaking, hammering, bracing. But more often, it was this. Just standing still enough to notice what wasn't asking, yet still deserved attention. The night was colder now. Not sharp, but present. The kind of cold that seeped in slowly, brushing fingertips and edging into the gaps between layers of cloth. The moon, just a sliver above the rooftops, cast long shadows that stretched across the village paths, like threads pulled taut. The builder's breath fogged faintly in the air as he made his way toward the outer edge of the marketplace. One of the awning supports had begun to tilt where the canvas had pulled unevenly. He untied the rope, reset the post into its stone footing, and tightened it again. Not too tight, just balanced. He passed the pottery stall next. A few shards from a broken vessel had been swept into a loose pile, but not gathered. He crouched, collected them in a cloth pouch, and tucked the pouch onto a shelf behind the stall. Clay dust clung to his fingertips, catching the moonlight like fine powder. Further on, a gutter had come unhooked above the bread shop. Rain would come eventually, and if left, water would pool near the foundation. He reached up, reset the latch, and tied a strip of twine around the bracket to hold it until he could return with tools. He paused at the fountain in the square. The surface of the water reflected the moon in thin, fractured shapes. A leaf floated by. He dipped a hand in, cleared away a clump of algae near the spout, then sat back on his heels for a moment. Nearby, the cloth merchant's shutter creaked gently in the wind, not enough to keep anyone awake, but enough to keep a watcher aware. He found the loosened hinge, added a wedge, and pressed the frame tight. The creak stopped. He looked up toward the rooftops. Chimneys stood silent, only a few still breathing faint smoke. Somewhere, a door latch clicked. A soft laugh echoed briefly. Someone coughed once, and then went quiet. The builder turned, walked along the edge of the square, and straightened a toppled crate without breaking stride. The village didn't stir, and that too was a kind of reply. Not all thanks come with words. Sometimes the answer is simply stillness and nothing left to do for now.